Okay, 1, 2, 3, here we go. So good afternoon, boa tarde, bem-vindos e bem-vindas. Welcome to this timely Brazil Lab event, debating the outcomes of the first round of presidential elections in Brazil. The runoff between Bolsonaro and Lula have us all on edge, wondering about the encroachment of authoritarianism, the future of democracy, and the changing nature of the social and the political in Brazil and beyond. My name is João Biel. I am professor and chair of anthropology and the director of the Brazil Lab here at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. We are delighted to organize this event in partnership with the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Program Latin American Studies, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Department of Anthropology. Last Sunday, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva fell short of the 50% of votes needed to win the election. He took a little over 48% of the votes, an incredible performance considering the political and legal ordeal he suffered after the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. The results also demonstrated that Jair Bolsonaro is far from an exception, and his support base is much larger than the polls had predicted, as he got over 43% of the votes and was able to elect several of his close allies to the Congress. Contrary to our wishes, that Bolsonaro was a paragraph in the country's troubled history, it seems that Bolsonarism is here to stay. It is alive and capillary, forming a stealth constituency and basically dividing the country very much like the United States of America. This is a frightening prospect, given Bolsonaro's consistent threats to democracy, the fueling of corruption, and the attack on constitutional rights, particularly of indigenous peoples. The financial market's positive reactions to Bolsonaro's bounce are equally alarming, revealing intimate connections between electoral autocracies and corporate power. To help us make sense of this turbulent political economic moment, we have two of Brazil's sharpest social scientists with us today. Laura Carvalho is the leading Brazilian economist and public intellectual. She's currently the global director of equity of the Open Society Foundations. Laura is the founder and director of the Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequality at the University of São Paulo, where she's professor of economics. Laura is the author of the best-selling book, Valsa Brasileira, Do Boom ao Caos Econômico, on the rise and fall of the Brazilian economy. Our good friend, also, Silvio Almeida, is Brazil's most acclaimed legal scholar, working on systemic racism and social inclusion. He's professor of law and philosophy at the Mackenzie Presbyterian University, where he directs the Inclusion and Diversity Project. And he's also a faculty at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo. An engaged public intellectual, Silvio writes regularly for Folha de São Paulo and is the author of the bestseller Racismo Estrutural. His new book, Estado, Direito e Raça no Pensamento Brasileiro, State, Law, and Race in the Brazilian Social Thought, will be published by Companhia das Letras this fall. We are honored to have our own Miguel Centeno as a discussant. Miguel is the Musgrave Professor of Sociology and Executive Vice Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. His scholarly work explores state building and war making in Latin America, global capitalism, and systemic risk. He's the author of the classic Blood and Debt. This is our format today. Laura and Silvio will speak for about 10-15 minutes each. Miguel will follow, taking a few minutes to offer a few comments and to ask a question or two. Silvio and Laura will then reply, and we will open the floor for discussion. The conversation will continue upstairs over drinks and snacks, and you're all warmly invited to stay to continue the conversation in the hall upstairs. So Laura, Silvio, and Miguel, thank you for being with us today. It's a great pleasure, a great honor. So Laura, the floor is yours. So let's give them a warm welcome.
Thank you, João. Thanks again for the invitation. Miguel, everyone from the Brazil Lab, it's great to be back, even if in a difficult time. I think last time I came here, It was a talk about the rise of the far right in Brazil and the economic and the possible economic roots for Bolsonaro's election in 2018. And now I think being back, as I was trying to sketch and outline these 15 minutes and what I could bring here, I think the economic roots are probably the least important aspects that we could treat. And as an economist, that puts me in a very difficult place to start with. But as I was thinking about, another part of that talk had to do with what we can see as common and different factors behind Bolsonaro's strength and other far-right platforms and political leaders and platforms around the world, especially in the West, but also in Hungary. And I think there are some elements that the results of the first round of the elections in Brazil can bring to that conversation. So I'll start by not answering the question, namely coup or not coup, because I think right now, maybe when we thought of this conversation and the moment it would happen, the largest threat was a coup or an actual coup in terms of not acceptance of election results. And as we're now in this strange moment, maybe the biggest threat is a new round of elected authoritarianism with a lot more support in Congress that can lead to still very high democratic risks, even if a coup or even if election results are accepted, maybe Bolsonaro will be reelected, right? That's still in the scenario, and I think we have to discuss that risk and what's involved. But mostly I would like to move to another interesting development, to say the least, which is like some changes in the profile of voters and supporters for Bolsonaro and Lula relative to 2018. And when I came here in 2018, I think one of the main points that I was trying to make is that the Workers' Party had lost ground relative to previous elections, mostly in voters that Datafolha, the poll institute that now is not in its best moment, let's say, but it's still what we have in terms of survey-based data that can give some hint on the political and economic, socioeconomic characteristics of voters. What we saw then is that voters who earned between 2 and 5 minimum wages in Brazil, 3 and 5 minimum wages in Brazil, were the ones where the Workers' Party lost more ground between 2014 and 2018. And mostly the voters we're talking about are voters in the peripheries of the big capitals and urban centers, especially in the Southeast, but also in the Northeast and in the south of the country. So if you, of course, look at absolute numbers, everyone will say that the Workers' Party has the majority of voters in the North and the Northeast, and therefore the bottom of the distribution. And that hasn't changed that much over time, at least not since 2006, since Lula's second term. You have pretty faithfully the bottom of the distribution supporting the PT and the Workers' Party. And it's also not that we saw much change in the top of the distribution that supported Aécio Neves against the PT and continued to support Bolsonaro in 2018, and is still supporting Bolsonaro overwhelmingly this year, right? So there isn't much change happening at the bottom and at the top. Most of the change that happened in 2018 and that again happened this year is in the middle. And when we think about the middle for a country like Brazil, in terms of actual numbers, that's That has a lot to do with the populations, the large number of people who live in the big cities and in the periphery of the big cities that actually had traditionally supported the Workers' Party in previous elections, but did not support the Workers' Party in 2018. And if some of you may remember, at least the Brazilians who are around, that you had this very famous speech by Mano Brown, this rapper in Brazil, in 2018, who was saying that the peripheries of the big cities had been lost, that PT and the Workers' Party had lost any connection to the population that is in the periphery of the big urban centers in Brazil. And if you look at the results of the first round of this election, an interesting aspect that you can see is that the Workers' Party won again, and the periphery of the big capitals went back to support the Workers' Party. There may be many reasons for that, but Workers' Party won in the capitals in this election, and it had lost in the capitals in 2018. And I think this is a major element that we need to understand, because if you think about it in the context of Brazil, that means that we return to some previous pattern in which the Workers' Party is having the support of the base, both in the Northeast and in other parts of the country, and also in the cities. But mostly, the interesting aspect is that Bolsonaro's support was very stable in the smaller municipalities and increased in some of the very small towns in the Northeast as well. And so I think Fernando Meirelles from SEBRAP, a political scientist, compiled some data this week that shows that municipalities with less than 50,000 voters in the Northeast of the countries actually saw an increase in the support for Bolsonaro of almost 3 percentage points in this election. And so we have two things that happened there. On the one hand, the voters in the peripheries of the big cities went back to support the Workers' Party, which, if you take everything else as constant, would probably have given Lula a victory in the first round. If you did not see an increase in the support at the Northeast, at these small cities in the Northeast for Bolsonaro, if you actually took the numbers of 2018 for the cities in the Northeast, with the support that the Workers' Party regained in the large capitals, probably it would have been sufficient. Of course, it's very hard to make this kind of counterfactual, but it would probably be sufficient for Lula to have won this election in the first round. It was very close, right? I mean, we need to look at things in perspective. If you look at the opinion polls, everyone is very disappointed. But if you actually look at the results, Lula had 48.5% of the votes, and it wasn't that far from getting a victory in the first round, which would have been historically tremendous, right? Having an incumbent president that is not the front runner in the second round is already never happened in history. It's the first time. To have an incumbent president losing in the first round of this election would have been historical. And I think we need to take that, to see that in terms of the economics of it, one possibility and one hypothesis for, therefore, the swing, let's say the fact that the periphery voters in the big centers stopped supporting the Workers' Party and now supporting them again, are now supporting Lula again, we can think about a couple of possibilities. And I think it deserves some research and serious research, and we can't really establish any type of causality based on very initial data here. But Okay, one hypothesis that is more politically driven could be that actually the Workers' Party responded to Mano Brown's provocations and the understanding that it wasn't anymore connected to the peripheries and did some efforts there. Maybe it's the case. I wouldn't know, and it's probably not my area. Maybe Silvio knows more about this because there's some racial component, there's some socioeconomic component to it. The fact that the Workers' Party was traditionally linked to those peripheries because of the industrial worker relationships, right, with the labor unions. But the labor unions, as you know, everywhere in the world are losing a lot given the transformations in the labor market, the degree of informality, self-employment, and so on. So that's one part of the story. Another possibility is that the economic crisis of 2015-16 was really deep. The corruption scandals and all of that took away the support that the Workers' Party traditionally had, or at least in the previous elections had, in these areas. And now the pandemic, the deep crisis, and the inability of the government to deliver that is even more dramatically so in the past couple of years has brought these workers back in a sort of response to the incumbent type of phenomenon that the political scientists know very well is economic-driven type of votes. Maybe it's a hypothesis as well. I think there may be other explanations, but I think what connects or may connect this to the debate, to the global debate about the rise of the far right, is that no matter what the explanation is, if you look at the overall results, this means that the Bolsonarismo and the structural element of Bolsonarismo is now a lot more connected to the non-urban centers, which doesn't mean that the elites in the capitals are not traditionally sepatistas, and they continue to be so. And that's also probably true for Donald Trump, who continues to have the support of traditional Republican elites. But if you look at the actual change and what's changing, maybe the support of the non-urban areas and the disconnect between the voters in the non-urban areas and the elites and the cosmopolitanism and all the values that we see in crisis, in a way, in the current context worldwide, is also a big piece of what's going on in Brazil. Maybe the fact that PT, the Workers' Party, now regained the support of the capitals is it's taking Brazil out of a position of outlier in the phenomena that we saw worldwide. Because before, Brazil was the only place where these movements or the far right was actually winning in the major urban centers. If you see other platforms, the U.S. is very clear. Trump never won in New York or L.A., right? And I think there is something there that we need to look into and that can approximate and even teach some lessons to the way we understand these other far-right movements, because maybe the commonalities are bigger and larger than we thought at first in terms of, because we keep thinking about evangelical churches and very specific aspects, and maybe they're just the means of something that is more general that has to do with a total disconnect between some cultures and the feeling of imposition of values and elitistic, patronizing views that we're seeing in different parts of the world as justifying these movements. But of course, there are also big differences in terms of the economic aspects of it. This is clear, the effects of globalization and what justifies the support in old industrial areas or the loss of the middle class in the workers, the white workers in the US, for instance, has a lot more to do with some type of the industrialization that has different, let's say, dynamics if you compare to what you see in the world in the Midwest, in the Centro-Oeste or the Midwest of Brazil, which is a lot more, also has to do with globalization, but a lot more with the commodity price cycles and agribusiness and other dynamics, right? So there are differences, of course, but in terms of the mentality, maybe not that much. So that's what I wanted to open the floor for the discussion with. In terms of the risks that we are now, and I think we can talk more about that. Given what I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that the Workers' Party regained these areas, and the fact that we were very close to have the election resolved in the first round, it's hard to see a victory of Bolsonaro in this election. It's hard to see. I'm not saying that it's impossible. Of course, we could lose even more ground in parts of the country that have traditionally supported the PT, or some new phenomena could happen that, including Bolsonaro himself has announced a new social benefit or an expansion in the Auxílio Brasil, the cash transfer program. So clearly his campaign sees that as having had an impact. And I think people are neglecting the fact that he won some cities that were traditionally supporting Workers' Party in the Northeast, and maybe he can gain even more ground there. It could be. But in general, if he's maintaining the support in the places where he already had the support, if he's losing the support of places that traditionally supported the Workers' Party, and if he's not gaining that much ground in places in the north and the northeast of Brazil, even if he's gaining some, maybe that's not sufficient, then it doesn't look like, it's hard to see from where his support could increase to the level that he needs for the second round. Of course, it's hard to make any predictions, but that's the most likely scenario that we should work with, which doesn't alleviate other risks that can be linked to not accepting election results. I think that risk is lower now because the first round results discredited the opinion polls institutes, not the electoral system. And all the energies of Bolsonarismo are now against the the institutes that do polling. And I mean, I really like statistics and the samples and the idea that you need to do surveys, but honestly, I mean, the risk of discrediting opinion polls institutes is a lot lower than the democratic risks of discrediting the electoral system. So we're already in a better position here than we were a few weeks ago, given that they are now on the contrary, thinking that the results are proving something, right? So they're trusting the electoral system then. But of course, if in the case of his victory, then the risks are much higher than a risk of a coup, because then he has a Senate that is a lot more conservative, specifically the Senate. I don't think the lower house is not changing significantly the composition, but the Senate, it was very, it was a big defeat for the Democratic spectrum, and he will have 2 Supreme Court nominations, which, as you know, in the U.S. can have long-lasting, dramatic implications. So I think that's what I had for the first introductory, very so close to the results that it's hard to make any comprehensive analysis. So I hope it wasn't too messy. And with that, looking forward to hear Silvio. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thanks, João, Pedro, Keyes, Miguel, Laura. Thank you so much. Laura filled my heart of hope because I don't know if I am so optimistic as Laura. Maybe because I'm looking the situation in a very close position. So, and in my opinion, not my opinion, my feeling is the situation in Brazil is very, very difficult. So, very difficult. It's not an easy situation. People, prepare yourself. Okay. I wrote my speak because I think it'll be easier to organize my ideas about the political process in Brazil. I confess that it's very difficult to make an analysis of the Brazilian conjuncture, and this is basically for two reasons. The first is that it is a very complex situation, And a good analysis must take into account the current situation in Brazil and its historical problems. The second reason that makes this analysis difficult is precisely the fact that I am immersed in the Brazilian reality, participating directly in the main events that take place in the country's politics. To help with the analysis, I have separated some points that I want to quickly present to you. First, everything that happens in Brazil today can only be understood in the light of its history. The history of Brazil is marked by what I have been calling structural tendencies, the result of its national formation and its process of insertion into the modern capitalist economy. These tendencies are economic dependency, authoritarianism, and racism, which always reappear in periods of crisis, breaking the fragile institutional arrangements of exist in the periods of democratic periods in Brazil. Bolsonaro is somehow born out of the complexities of Brazilian national formation and the crisis that has surfaced Brazilian society's dependent and democratic and racist tendencies. But it's important to point out that Bolsonaro is also the Brazilian response to authoritarian and racist tendencies that have emerged at a global level and the deepening of neoliberal policies that bring the destruction of the welfare state. 2, on authoritarian tendencies. Bolsonaro is a legitimate son of the military dictatorship that lasted 20 years in Brazil. Is strongly supported by the military and policy states. Bolsonaro has been undermining the credibility of the polls since the beginning of the elections. Laura talked about it. The idea is to provoke distrust in the population and say that his re-election would be the only acceptable result. 3, how to describe the Bolsonaro government? 7 points. The systematic dismantling of public administration, the destruction of politics of social and human rights, public budget capture, the strong presence of military personnel in first and second tier government posts, encouraging violence and carrying weapons, overly racist and misogynistic speech, destruction of environmental policy in the name of economic interests. Another important issue is the fact that we have spent the last few years neglecting the power of ideology. Maybe this point, in my opinion, in the middle of the facts of the day, is the most important point about ideology. Ideology. The power, the force of ideology to explain the rise of the far right in the world. I think we, professors, intellectuals, are neglecting the power of ideology. Not ideology as a bunch of ideas, but ideology as a form to build feelings in people. It's not that Bolsonaro managed to convince people that he's a good president. Bolsonaro is not a good president. What he does is make use of the architecture of fear, hatred, and deprivation already present in Brazilian society. Bolsonaro, like other far-right leaders, knew how to work with affection, people. Affection is the word. Affections as fear, resentment, hatred, intolerance. All Brazilian politics today is driven by two central affections, hate and fear. Hatred of corrupt politicians, hatred of minorities who supposedly earn without working, hatred of work unions and social movements that all make trouble, and fear of crime, fear of hunger, fear everywhere, which also explain the growth of religious fundamentalism in Brazil. Fear of and hatred that can be observed even in the statistics linked to the Brazilian Brazilian far right, are always related to death. Brazil is a country that's now used to death and has death as a solution to its many problems. Liberals and the left-wingers have underestimated the importance of affections in politics. So, Bolsonaro seems always be one step ahead of us because he doesn't talk to people's reason. He speaks to people's desire. The same desire that we try to contain with education, law. I'm a lawyer. I know. What is it? Try to contain the bad feelings, try to contain the hate, education, institutionalization. That's the reason why Bolsonaro hates teachers, for example. All this is a barrier to the realization of a childish desire to the whatever you want without responsibility. In the sense, Bolsonaro does not deceive society. He expresses it. Bolsonaro is an expression of the Brazilian feelings, the deep Brazilian feelings. He is the enjoyment of the authoritarian man. And this desire for freedom makes him fully identify with the most varied sectors of society. 5. Prognosis. Prognosis. Today we can say that Brazilian faces, we're not to be afraid to say openly, clearly, Bolsonaro is a fascist. Bolsonarismo is fascism. Fascism, so, pardon me, nazism. Bolsonarism, Brazilian faces, is not a specific event, but is a phenomenon deeply rooted in Brazilian society. People, look at the results of the election. The Brazilian democracy wanted Bolsonarism. Wanted Bolsonarism. The electoral process confirmed Bolsonarism. It's a question, I repeat, the question of desire. Desire. The initial question about whether there will be a coup or not, I answer as Lydia Schwartz said in a recent interview, Bolsonaro is the coup. Bolsonaro is the daily coup on Brazilian democratic institution. We don't need a coup, a military coup, a traditional coup. Bolsonaro is our daily coup, every day, every night, every time. Bolsonaro is couping Brazilian democracy. His reason for being president is to demolish public institutions, privatize the public budget, and reinforce racial and social hierarchies. Bolsonaro presents something new in Brazilian society. White supremacy. White supremacy. Bolsonarism is the rise of white supremacy. It's different to talk about white superiority. Bolsonaro bring us a Brazilian version of white supremacy. Okay? As to the indigenous people, as to the people, the black people, the Afro-descendant people in favelas, periferias in Brazil. Bolsonaro, the new Bolsonaro term, a re-election of Bolsonaro, would consolidate the power of the far right in Brazil. The last elect destroyed the liberal right in Brazil. There is no liberal right in Brazil. There's no liberals in Brazil. Institutionalized liberals in Brazil. There's no more. Yeah? In fact, it's important to highlight how the liberal governors in states such as São Paulo and Minas Gerais hurried to support President Bolsonaro, which proves something known since 19th century. Brazilian liberalism has not commitment to democracy, and even to democracy, freedom that it claims to defend. We can watch the emergence of institutionalized and organic far right, strongly supported by three-pod evangelical churches, military, and agribusiness. The new far right in Brazil is a rooted far right. It's not an eventual far right. It's a far right with social roots, economic roots, agribusiness, and enforcing the economic dependency in Brazil. The steer economic dependence in Brazil. Evangelical churches in a conservative way, a social basis of Bolsonarism in Brazil, and military people consolidating the roots of Bolsonarism in the Brazilian state. They have guns. We don't have guns. Understanding? People with guns, with faith, and with money. The result, more authoritarianism, more racism, and more economic dependence. For the preservation of democracy in Brazil, the election of Lula is essential. Essential. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be easy. It would be very difficult. Very difficult. Bolsonaro is not a threat to Brazil. Bolsonaro is a global. You understand? Bolsonaro is a global threat. Bolsonaro is a threat to democracies in all the world. Not the institution of democracy. I'm talking about people. I'm talking about minorities. I'm talking about indigenous people. I'm talking about black people in the world. I'm talking about gay people. Bolsonaro is a global threat. Bolsonaro confirmed, could be confirmed the power of the far right and the force of the ideas and the machine of desire production of the far right in the world. Therefore, the surveillance and support of the international community are essential. We need help in Brazil. We need action. We need politics. We need transformation. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for the invitation, Jean, Miguel, and those great presentations. Every time I come to a Brazil lab, I swear I'm going to improve my Portuñol into real Portuguese, and I never do. So you have to excuse me if I have to do this in English. So let me ask 3 questions of both of our teams. First is, how Brazilian is Bolsonaro? And by that I mean, as opposed to global authority. That is Bolsonaro just Modi, Trump, Urban, choose your Putin? Fortunately, he doesn't have tanks. Or is there, what is the Brazilian? I define sociology sometimes as the science of how everything is the same, but each thing is different. So is Bolsonaro the same that we're seeing everywhere? And we see some of the same patterns, the dissatisfaction of the lower middle class, the deinstitutionalization, the racism, the privileging of a particular kind of identity. And again, so how Brazilian is this? Is this a Brazilian version of the same story? Or is there something specific about Brazil that we have to understand? And I'm particularly interested in the cultural aspect. I think attempts to try to explain Trump economically, I read Marx when I was young, and I still believe that sometimes we have to read Marx. Attempts to explain Trump economically have pretty much failed. And I think, Laura, you were sort of implying that this isn't sort of the after effects of the 2014, 2015 shock. This is a particularly cultural. I still remember, I know this would be a sad moment for all of you Brazilians, I still remember 8 years ago, the game with Germany. And I said, I wouldn't want to be president of Brazil when you lose to Germany 7-1. How much of this is not just the decline that happens in the economy, but that symbolic fall? I mean, there was the famous Economist cover of the Cristo rising like a rocket, and then there was another version with the Cristo going like this and landing in the water. How much was it that? How much was it just this moment of deception, this moment of not feeling good? And again, the deinstitutionalization, to what extent Brazil has never been known for the solidity of its institutions, except the central bank and perhaps the foreign service. Is this the same deinstitutionalization that's going on throughout the world? So I want to ask that set of questions. The second set of questions is, and I've been reading up on the Brazil coup of 1964. How do you compare it? The 1964 coup was very ideological. I take it. The 64 coup definitely involved the United States. How is this different? How is Brazil different in 2022 from 1964? The military was able, by April 1, April 2, the military, from my understanding, the military had pretty much control. They didn't really have to use a lot of violence. Would that be the case today? And a very important question, if there was to be a coup or a post-election coup or whatever you want to call it, would the Brazilian military have the capacity to impose itself? It did so in 1964. Again, relatively easily. They're the famous photographs of the tanks outside the Congress in Brazil. Those tanks, from what I understand, again, never had to shoot. Would that be the case again? Would the military be able to impose this? And then the last set of questions. I keep thinking about I've been looking for the last 2 or 3 days, Googling like crazy, demographics of election in Brazil, blah, blah, blah. And some patterns are really clear. There's the age split. There's the regional split. I mean, if you look at a map of everybody's been producing the Brazilian version of the red-blue maps, and it's very clear there's a divide. The west and south versus the north and the east. Urban versus rural. Some of you who are Americans some of this should sound very familiar. There is a division by race. The concept of being, let's put it this way. How much non-white support did Bolsonaro have? Or is this a pretty clear line? Is it as clear as it is in the United States, for example? Class. Laura was telling us that there's a very clear support for Bolsonaro in the high business. Does he have the support of someone we should not forget from the 19th century, the petite bourgeoisie, which have been very important in the rise of Trump? Does Bolsonaro have that in his corner? By gender and LGBTQ issues, I've been struck. Well, after Trump, maybe it's hard not to be struck, but I've been struck by the clearly popular homophobic discourse of Bolsonaro. How much a role is that? And finally, just my ideology. And my question, given all these different splits, all these classic demographic splits, which one would you favor? If you had, and Silvio, perhaps you'd do this, if you could advise Lula where to spend your money, do you try to convince the West and the South? Do you try to convince men? Do you try to convince the professional middle class? Where do you see this critical split? And with that, with just those small questions, I'll leave it to you. Thank you very much.
We have our panelists up front here. And Miguel, can you help to see if the mics are working? The mics are working. Okay, great. Okay, great. And then, so Laura, and thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Laura and Silvio. So Laura and Silvio, please, take an aspect, a question, or one of the main points that Miguel made, and then we will go around the room to collect a few more questions as bundles for you all.
Okay, thanks, Miguel. I think, these are pretty much all $1 million questions, but I'll start with the first one, because I think that was maybe the first and the last are very connected to what I was trying to say there. So how Brazilian is Bolsonaro? I think that question was a very hard one to answer in 2018. And if you look at the demographics as a first approach to this question, I think in the race, gender, and almost all the dimensions, class, almost all the dimensions, the petit bourgeoisie, there is a very strong similarity in the support for Bolsonaro and the support for other elected authoritarians, at least, around the world. So that I think is, and the age as well, I think is very clear. The support for Bolsonaro amongst women, actually the gender dimension is very, very clear-cut in Brazil, as it is here. The urban versus rural wasn't a dimension that was clear in Brazil in 2018. And I think that's where we are getting closer, and that's the main point I was making there, which doesn't mean that the reasons are the same, but just in terms of the data and the overall picture, I think now we can say that there is an urban versus rural. The concept of rural is a bit different here and there, but anyway, I think that's a clear. But if we look at the conversation, and so that does, and I would reinforce that point, I think that does hint into more cultural explanations of this phenomenon that I think are common, or at least a big part of it is explained by these phenomena that are more into the cultural, sociological, historical sides, but that are true in several societies and that we can see as true in many parts of the world. When you look at the economic debate about elected authoritarianism, the factors that are the drivers, let's say, that are considered the most important for these phenomena in Hungary or in the US, or for the support for Brexit in the UK, or even for far-right movements in Western Europe in general, seem to be a lot more, I mean, you have two sets of drivers that are linked to economic policies and economic paradigms, I think. One is the one that focuses on globalization and its effects and how ethno-nationalism has increased and expanded based on the effects, especially in industrial manufacturing sectors, and the role of China and the role of the imports, and how the jobs and the immigrants have been blamed for part of the economic discontent that arose from that. So that's one set of drivers that are considered crucial in these places that are not considered crucial in Brazil and cannot be, right? The effects of globalization in Brazil, even if there are some effects in terms of the industrialization, is not that we had a thriving manufacturing sector even before that, and even more so, clearly, we benefited from Chinese growth to some degree in the 2000s, which actually allowed for a lot of the social policies and progress that Lula was able to implement, right? So in many ways, the commodity price boom and Chinese growth actually gave the possibility for some reduction in inequality, wage gains at the bottom of the distribution, and things that did not happen in any of the other places we're talking about. And I think that's a very important difference. And as Silvio said, this doesn't mean that the Bolsonarismo is less rooted in economic elements, because obviously the same Chinese growth that did allow for that also had to do with the growth of agribusiness, and now it's a big sociological basis for Bolsonarismo in the country, and that environmental movements are seen as just patronizing and fighting and as opposing any kind of economic development in these regions. And I think there is a specificity that is linked to maybe the same global phenomenon, but with very different repercussions. The question here is, okay, then maybe economic factors are less important overall. That may be true even here than these cultural factors. I don't know. given the striking difference, or maybe they just are reflected in different ways. I think we should also distinguish, and this election is very clearly telling that story in Brazil, the more structural component. As an economist, we always like to separate structure from cycles, right? Tendencies from cycles. I think there is a cyclical component to this phenomena that we're seeing when we think about electoral victories that is economic. And so Trump probably would have been reelected if it wasn't for the economic crisis of the pandemic. It wouldn't be crazy to say that, right? So there is a structural component, but there is a cyclical component that is economic, or at least has a big role for economic factors that can be important enough to shift and create an incumbent paying the price for being an incumbent in a bad economic crisis. And Bolsonarismo had the same. In 2018, he benefited from a cyclical economic component. In 2022, he's getting harmed by that same. So it doesn't mean that economics doesn't matter. It's just mattering to, maybe it's mattering so much that it can shift to one side or the other, what the final result will be, and the risks that are a consequence of this election are so significant that in the end, the economic factors that can bring some voters back or some voters away are very crucial. But I agree with Silvio in the sense that there is a structural rooted element there that I think is not that different from what we see in other parts of the world. Of course, with our racial history and all the different aspects that I think the violence and all the aspects that are very, very relevant to understand Brazilian society that I think Silvio explained. Silvio, there's one thing that I want to say, which is I like to be the optimistic in the room because I was never an optimist. I was never known as an optimist, but I have to say, maybe I'm optimistic in the cyclical component and not in the structural big roots of the problems here. So,
yeah, the same to me. The same to me. Yes, optimistic and yeah. Understand Brazil demand us to understand the dynamic between national and international, national and global, because a country is formed by external influences and the specificities of its culture. For example, race in Brazil, race and racism. Race is a global phenomenon, formed by the slave trade, the modern society, the formation of modern capitalism. But in each country, the elements of the modernity reveal itself in a specific way. Race in Brazil is different than race in United States. It's the same, but it's different. You're very smart sentence. Be a black man in the United States is the same, but it's different to be a black man in the United States, in Brazil. The components, the forms of the institutionalization of race is different. And the same in economy. Laura is our specialist here. Currency. Currency is different to talk about currency in Brazil, to talk about currency in the United States. But in capitalism, we need currency. Okay? So, about Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is authoritarian leader. Bolsonaro is a typical Brazilian authoritarian leader. Was a typical authoritarian leader formed by global conditions and rooted in national culture, national history, and the form that Brazil absorbed the social forms of capitalism. Social forms of capitalism. State, law, currency, and state, law, currency, and ideology, culture. Okay? So, the question is, Bolsonaro is Brazilian. Brazil is Brazilian. Yeah. It's almost the same question. Okay? Resume. It's impossible to understand the Brazilian social formation and Bolsonaro without understanding the global conditions and the specific moments, and the crisis. It's very important to talk about crisis. We often forget to talk about crisis of capitalism. We need courage to affirm it. We live in a world in crisis. What crisis? Crisis in the reproduction of social forms, state, law, culture, ideology, and currency, money, whatever. Okay? It's crisis, and the crisis appears in Brazil, the United States, produce Trump, produce Bolsonaro, Orbán, whatever. Miguel, about this, the score of the game, Brazil and Germany. I want to talk to about it. It's very important to to affirm my position about it, because we used a very good expression, symbolic fall. Yes, the score was a symbolic fall, a downgrade of the nationality, because soccer is not only a game for us. Soccer is an essential element of our nationality. So, the new state under Getúlio Vargas dictatorship choose three elements to represent the Brazilian culture. Soccer is not a specific sport, it's a national sport. Okay? Samba, music, it's the same in the United States with jazz, with other kinds of music. It's a global phenomenon to elect symbols of culture, symbols of nationality. And the paperworks, carteira, I don't know, how can I say it in English? CLT.
Doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. Okay. Workers. It's not the same because as, in the United States doesn't exist. Doesn't exist the similarity between
labor rights don't really.
Yes.
Drive.
Brazil is a very civilized society. We have rights for workers. So, because when I said that it doesn't exist the similarity between citizenship and the condition of employee. I don't know, the labor rights. Labor rights as a condition of citizenship. So, there's a book by Boris Fausto about it. A cidadania regulada, the regulated citizenship. Okay? Symbols, soccer, samba, and CLT. You understand? 2014. Soccer, down, Samba not down, but yes.
Don't be that
Thanks,
pessimistic. We
thanks
still
God.
have
Samba. I still have samba, but CLT down.
That's true.
Understand? So your comparison between soccer and the social situation in Brazil is very good. Difference between the coup in 1964 and the possible coup, possible not, a coup in 2016. In 2016, there was a coup d'etat in Brazil. Coup d'etat. I affirm it. I think Laura agrees with me. A parliamentary coup d'etat in Brazil. Okay, so difference: the global situation, the national situation, the similarities, the military people involved, in different ways, but involved. Bolsonaro government is a military government in a different way. Okay, a different way. There are 6,000 militaries in government now. Okay, the candidate of vice president of Bolsonaro is a general. To understand the risks of Brazil, the second person in the state power in Brazil could be a military. So it's not easy to understand and accept it. So what Lula have to do? I don't know. So, but maybe put energy in Minas Gerais. Minas Gerais is theirs and Mineiros here. Yeah, Minas is a world, a different world. It's a very complex state. Very, very poor in some areas, rich in other areas, without contact with the center. They stayed with with many cities. I think 1,800 cities in Minas Gerais. 800 cities in Minas Gerais. So maybe Lula must put energy in Minas Gerais, in São Paulo, and guarantee the northeast of Brazil. Maybe.
Okay, so let's get going now. Let's collect a few questions. Let's try to exercise the art of condensation, right? So we can hear more voices here. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Laura a bit more about the shift in the urban peripheries, because, I mean, you were one of the first people to point this out in 2018, and then there were a number of ethnographers who came in and started producing research that showed that actually the cultural values in the urban peripheries are very much aligned with Bolsonarismo, and that it's not, yes, there's been a kind of economic structural basis for this, but there's also a cultural affinity, at least, in these places. So that leads me to wonder, well, why would the urban peripheries then switch? And is there something particular about this election that is not just about Brazil reverting to a kind of global mean, but that there's something about maybe just the particularity of Lula as a candidate that might explain this shift, that you would expect in the future the urban peripheries to continue along this exceptional track?
Okay, good.
Thank you, Laura and Silvio. It's always good to see and have you back here. I Silvio, honestly, I was not prepared for such a grim analysis. I'm devastated. I wanted actually to ask you to kind of respond to Laura, and it's not that I'm trying to find a sort of a middle term, but it's interesting that Laura started by quoting Mano Brown's famous, back in the 2018 elections, when he referred to this disconnection of the Workers' Party with the peripheries, etc. The point is that the peripheries here mean something and mean, above all, race also, and that's something interesting. It's also interesting that the rapper is the oracle here. I think this is not casual. But even if the red-blue urban and rural divide has been capped, you are saying that, Laura, that the PT would have, supposedly there are numbers for that, has regained the connection with the urban peripheries. And considering that the urban peripheries equals race here, in very generic terms, I would ask actually Silvio to respond to that and try to understand what Laura is trying to say. And maybe I'm just trying to regain some hope within the cloud darks of your analysis, Silvio. I'm just kidding, but I really loved your talks. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have two more here. Great. Our philosopher and our historian.
Thank you so much for the presentations. So I have a question about the pandemic and whether the pandemic sort of had an impact on the change between 2018 and 2022. Bolsonaro was, of course, sort of very extreme and controversial sort of in how the pandemic was handled, how it was responded to. Might this have something to do with the change of attitude, especially in the cities, in the peripheries of the cities?
Hello, thank you so much, Laura and Silvio, for your talks. My question is pretty similar to what Pedro mentioned, and I'm a historian of slavery in Brazil. I have a colleague here at Princeton that usually tells me and other faculty members that hope is not a strategy, and I disagree. I think hope is a way of mobilizing people, and it's what we hold on to in moments of despair to kind of move forward. So I'm also trying to look for a different angle to understand the elections, even though I absolutely agree with you, Silvio. And I think it's important to think about Bolsonarismo not as just a backlash to the rise of PT and the Workers' Party in Brazil, but to think about it as white supremacy, to name it as it is, and understand its structural roots that are very Brazilian too. My question is, so how is it that, given the force of white supremacy in Brazil, of support for Bolsonaro, the votes that he got, not only himself, but, what happened to Parliament, instead of kind of exceptional moments, like we were not expecting this, Bolsonaro rose too much, how is it that we read then the fact that the PT still won this election, and that maybe it's a moment of crisis, but also of historical reckoning with these structural challenges that Brazil has been circumventing for such a long time? So is it that we are also in a moment, like kind of a showdown, where finally things became clear and we have more of a dispute here, rather than one side that is clearly winning? There is discontent also on the other side, and that gets expressed in Lula's victory in the first round. That's my take on hope, but I don't know if that's going to fly. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I have a question too, and I think it's connected to all the other questions, or maybe it adds another angle. Laura, it was striking the way the international markets reacted, or maybe not, maybe it was expected. So I would like to hear a little bit more about the way the markets are working this election, or possibly Lula's victory, but what does that do to a Lula government, the way the markets are reacting in such a festive way with Bolsonaro's strong showing in the first round? And Silvio, you really, your words, is resonated deeply with many of us, and I think there is a search for a kind of a language, how to live with this dreadful reality in which you're governed through death and fear. In the case of a Lula election, given this scenario, it's more like a crystal ball kind of question, but keeping the sense of the real that you gave us, what do you think a Lula government is able to do, given this scenario? Anyway, you guys go.
Okay, these are all great. So the shift in the peripheries, and I think starting to think about possible relations to the culture and the economic and how intertwined they are, and the pandemic, I think, is also a good hypothesis. There is an element to the argument that the anthropologists who are studying this, including Rosana Pinheiro Machado and Isabel Khalil, and the people who are studying Bolsonarismo, that links the cultural values to the conditions of self-employment and the conditions of vulnerable workers in the big peripheries that I think have the appeal of something that is actually another element that distinguishes Bolsonaro from other platforms around the world, which is the fact that he was elected with a platform. We can talk about the actual policies later, but with a platform that was actually based on on market fundamentalists neoliberal views, which is not the case for Orban, and it's not the case for Trump even, right? There is some anti-systemic economic approach, even if we can say that in the policies, in reality, it's not really the case, that Trump gave tax cuts for the rich, or that Orban in the end is favoring the elites as well. In the discourse, in the electoral platform, these were people who were elected against the economic status quo to some degree, at least either in terms of the trade, protectionism approach in the US. In the case of Orban, it's more anti-European Union and some level of he started by saying he would tax the banks, right? So it's a very different economic discourse there. And Bolsonaro instead was elected with the support of the financial elites and with a finance minister to whom he said he would delegate the entire economic policy, who came from Chicago and who was in Chile with Pinochet, right? So there is something there. There was it's very Brazilian in some ways. And I think that connection in 2018 was an interesting one. And I think I made the point, and I agreed with the analysis that associated the corruption in Brazil, how the people perceived corruption as something that was creating economic crisis, and therefore getting rid of the state altogether was probably a best way to do it. And these are people who weren't feeling that they benefited from state policies anyway. And I think that worked. But there is something cyclical to this as well, because it was a moment of deep economic crisis. And it's true that the peripheries, the urban peripheries, they benefited a lot from the economic boom of the 2000s through the labor market, through the actual economic growth that brought together with it a big dynamic labor market, especially services grew a lot in that time, that these are very labor-intensive sectors that rely on low-skilled labor, so the periphery benefited a lot in terms of income gains during Lula's years. But this was very much linked to the dynamism of the Brazilian economy. It's different from the basis of the Northeast that benefited more from social transfers and cash transfers directly from the government. It's different. And the association that someone who receives the government cash transfer has with the government, the role of the state, is a lot stronger than someone who benefited from an economy that is booming and therefore got their own job, or even as a self-employed started making their living in a much better way and better conditions because just the labor market is stronger and the power of bargaining of workers is stronger. So I think there is something there that actually has to do with Lula. Because then, okay, what's there in 2018 for the people who are in this situation, who stopped benefiting, who instead were suffering the disproportionate effects of the historically deep economic recession in the country in 2015 and 16, who saw corruption as maybe part of as a source of the economic crisis, or one of the drivers of the economic crisis, even if it isn't, but they still perceive that way. And then we're not benefiting from that moment and associated the Workers' Party, and especially Dilma Rousseff's administration, with that moment. And so the role of the state did not appear as clearly to them. I think this created a particular configuration that does associate some cultural aspects and some economic aspects, and maybe the economic aspects just set the stage for some of these cultural identity elements. But then what's going on now? Then you have this new moment after a pandemic in which what was already a deep crisis became an even deeper crisis. And these are peripheries that were also not as benefited as the bottom of the distribution in the Northeast by the big, large cash transfer programs that Bolsonaro's government, not by their own initiative, but through Congress and pressure from civil society, approved. So that's so this population was not benefited and actually suffered the impact of the pandemic in the health side and in the economic side the most, including with a very big racial dimension to it. The initial data that I've seen did not find a big correlation between cities that had higher death rates and vote for Bolsonaro. But these were just correlations. I think there needs to be serious studies of this still to identify how big of a role it has played. But in any case, I think Bolsonaro lost a lot of ground there, which does not mean that Lula doesn't play a big role. Because if we go back to Mano Brown, Pedro, and the disconnect of the Workers' Party with the periphery, how much of it is Lula's disconnect and how much of it is Fernando Haddad's disconnect, or how much of it is the Workers' Party? And it's hard to disentangle these things, and it doesn't seem like Lula is very disconnected from the base, right? Doesn't strike me as, what Silvio was saying, that politics is passion and politics is affection. It does seem that Lula still has what a lot of the center-left and technocratic parties around the world don't. And I think that is a big piece that helps as well explain the reversal. It's not a reversal to the mean, it's more, it's not a reversal to the global mean. It's actually something that is very Brazilian. It's that Lula does appeal and manages to appeal to a part of the population that maybe it wasn't the case in 2018 for some cyclical and some structural reasons. International markets. Markets. This is I think a question that comes back in every election in Latin America. There are many studies that this happens, and there is financial panic every time a left-wing or even center-left candidate wins. I don't think there's a part of it. If you saw, the markets also went up after there was a picture that Henrique Meirelles took with, this is the former president of the central bank, who's loved by financial elites, and he took a picture with Lula and supported Lula in the first round, and then the markets went up. There's a part of it that has to do with the fact that markets, as Keynes would say, are beauty contests in which any kind of news, any piece of news, give this kind of, I mean, if you are the first one to bet on a higher price, you win, right? And this is, you were looking for news in any election dispute to make more money, because the first mover will make the money. And any news like that creates money for a lot of people, right? And that's the case for Bolsonaro in the first round. If the convention is so in the market that Bolsonaro win is best, that's enough to create this kind of dynamic, which doesn't mean necessarily a structural trend in the market. Sometimes it's just very short run type of reactions that have to do with contagion effects based on specific news. That's one thing. It's different than the part that has to do with what is the actual support that Bolsonaro has by financial elites in the country. That doesn't necessarily, I mean, there is an association and a connection, but it's not necessarily the case that it is connected. There may be a convention in market participants. That doesn't mean that these people are all supporting the candidate, right? These are two different things. And if you look at what happened with the elites in Brazil, it's interesting because the pandemic comes back here. We talk about the peripheries a lot, but there has been a shift in the urban elites since 2018 as well due to the pandemic. I don't think it's very substantial for electoral calculations because we're still talking about the 1 or 2% top of the distribution and the population. But there was a change. I think everyone here probably experienced that tradition. I want to say intellectual elites, but it's broader than intellectual elites who were traditionally anti-petista, who never voted for the Workers' Party before, did so in the first round. And I think the pandemic played a major role in that explanation, but that's just a guess based on personal experience, not as any data-driven analysis. It's really striking how you see in Brazil people who would never expect, people whose Facebook pictures were black in grief after 2014's Dilma's election, now actively supporting Lula in the first round. There was something, and that I think also contributed to shift the urban vote, because the anti-Bolsonarismo became stronger than anti-Petismo in some sections that are, I think, more illustrated, educated, highly educated people.
So, let me come back to my friend Mano Brown. Mano Brown, I think there was yesterday, I heard a story. I don't remember when told his story, but about a domestic worker that worked in a church, cleaning the church, and she was not evangelical. She's not a member of the church, okay? But it is a history of conversion. Why? One day, this domestic worker went to the church, and the members of the church preparing for her a birthday party. And it was the first time in her life that he was a birthday party. And in this moment, she said, I belong to this place. Okay? A history of conversion. I think Mano Brown, the sentence of Mano Brown means the feeling of belong. How to establish a communal life. A communal life. Feelings of belonging, friendship. I think Mano Brown talked about it specifically. So, because the Brazilian state always disorganized the communal life. That is the historical dynamic of the Brazilian state. So, your question about white supremacy, I think is, and the question of João too. Pedro, I believe that Lula will win the election. Okay? I believe it. But I'm worried about what he can do after the election. Understand? That's the question. So, what's the capacity of Lula da Silva to deal with the structural tendencies of Brazilian society? So, it's important to talk about it, because if Lula don't do nothing about the Brazilian crisis, economic crisis, a new Bolsonaro will waiting for us in the corner. See? Maybe Bolsonaro intelligent, so more, I don't know, more educated, so maybe. So for this reason, it's very important to win this election. Win this election is the guarantee that we can dispute the Brazilian society. And there's no illusion. Power is reality. We need power. Without power, it's impossible to change the desire of the people. Schools, for example, Secretary of Education is very important. Secretary of Economy is very important to orientate the desire of the people, to dispute the society. We need power. We need power. This election, if for this reason, I'm so sorry for my dark tone, but this election is election that I feel in that my life is in game. I'm a black guy. I'm a black guy. I feel in every day that my country is trying to kill me. So my darker tone is about it. I'm optimistic, a rational optimism, like Gramsci. Okay. The pool, a new pool, 51-43. It's good. But my word that the governors, the far right, the liberals are bargaining with Lula, trying to limitate the power of Lula, the power of the state, the influence of the people, the poor people in the new government. Understand? About pandemic. So, Bolsonaro deal with people's desire. People's desire. Pandemic. Bolsonaro transformed pandemic not a political problem, not in a political problem, but a individual guilty. Understand? If you are sick, it's your problem. Okay? Chloroquine, so understand? Is a neoliberal subjectivity. Okay? There's no politics. There's no politics. There's guilty. There's individual form to deal with the problem. Okay? So pandemic. Bolsonaro is not responsible. Bolsonaro is a child. Is an old child. There is no responsibility, there's no guilty, there's no consequences. Okay? I repeat, he represents the desire for freedom without limits, without responsibility. Is the opposite, even the classical liberalism. Because the freedom, the class liberalism is a freedom with responsibility. The social contract. There is no social contract. Is market. Okay? Liberty is a result of the bargaining, a contract, and business. It's Bolsonaro. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. That was I was going to say, you gave us this incredible question, so the final word is with you.
Why? Oh, I have needed a mic in yours. I have a very loud voice. Why was Bolsonaro able? One of the things that struck me as I watched YouTube and the news was Bolsonaro's monopoly over the national colors. And if you looked at a Bolsonaro rally, you could be at a World Cup football game. Because everybody's wearing green and yellow, and there's flags. That's a very American, Republicans take the flag and all that. How did that happen? Is that always been an issue, or is that something new?
It started in 2016, I think, in the process of impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. Yeah, it started in 2016. It was before Bolsonaro. And I think it does speak to that commonality. I mean, the sense of community that Silvio is talking about that appeals also has to do with the sense of nationality in some degree. And I think these are aspects that we're seeing in all these movements in different parts of the world. The fact that you see the foreign or the cosmopolitans or the elites as imposing and attacking what is actually the community and the country and the common values and the tradition. And I think these are the elements that are in all these movements, even if maybe the 7-1 score helps explain the fact that we don't wear that shirt anymore as well, right? Like, I feel it's hard, and Lula is reclaiming it, right? The campaign is reclaiming the flag. The national flag was on Sunday when Lula went to Avenida Paulista to celebrate. He had a big Brazilian flag. People did wear the Brazil jersey to go vote, even the supporters, Lula supporters. So there is an attempt to reclaim the flag that I think is part of the strategy.
In my opinion, part of this abandon of the national symbols as the Brazilian soccer team T-shirt is a fault of the left-wingers and the liberals in Brazil too, because there was a separation between national perspectives and liberal and leftist positions. Okay, so for many people in the left wing, is ugly to be nationalist.
That's very dangerous.
You know, to be nationalist. But nationalism, the idea of nations is a very complicated idea, so race and so, but in the conditions of Latin America, in the conditions of the periphery of the capital, nationalism is a form of communalism, to make imaginary of community. Benedict Anderson, imaginary community. Yes, it's the same. The idea is, if you don't dispute a piece of cloth, how we intend to dispute the Brazilian state? So, a curiosity: the man that designed the Brazilian T-shirt, the soccer team, was a left-winger. The original, the first one, the left-winger. So the far right captures the national symbols, because the far right capture the feelings, capture the desire. So for liberals and left-wing people, it's necessary to talk to the imagination, the social, to constitute a new imagination, to show the people that it's possible to dream with a new society. Okay? It's our lesson. It's our work.
We hear you, and we are so grateful for you to leave us with this sense of a possible imagination. And Laura, thanks so much as well for your always lucid, clear, and provocative take on things. And Miguel, thank you for being a team player here and kicking off the discussion with this wonderful set of questions. So